On a beautiful Sunday in June of 1975, a firefighter was called by concerned neighbors to come extinguish a fire in one of the barbecue pits in China Camp State Park. The remnants of the fire was initially thought to be remains of an animal forgotten by hunters, but unknowingly to all those present, they had just found the remains of a loved couple, Jim and Naomi Olive. What unfolded after left the town shaken, and years later, this story still sends shivers down the spines of all those who knew the family. James Olive, commonly called Jim, was in the army when he met Naomi Wagner. The two soon became inseparable and fell in love. They got married in 1944. When the war ended in 1945, Jim was discharged from the army and the newly married couple moved to Panama. They chose Panama because at that time, the real estate business was thriving and Jim wanted to take advantage of it. The young couple, although doing well for themselves, wanted one thing: to grow their family. But this was proving to be difficult, and so, they continued living their lives. When 10 years passed and they still had no child, they decided to adopt a child. On January 14, 1959, they got the long-awaited call. An unwed teenager had just put to bed and wasn't able to take care of the child, and so she put the child up for adoption. The Olives were ecstatic about the good news and got their baby girl the day after. They named her Marlene Louise Olives, and the family was finally complete. But, soon after, Naomi became obsessed with everything being clean, and for the first 6 months of Marlene's life, she wore surgical face masks and convinced her husband to do the same before touching the baby. As Marlene grew up, things became worse. The summer after Marlene's adoption, Jim took a job in Ecuador, and the family relocated. There, he worked as a marketing executive. As Marlene grew up, her mother Naomi became addicted to alcohol, and it was reported that she was thought to be schizophrenic. Due to her alcoholism and mental illness, Naomi became unbearable. She would always call her daughter all sorts of names, one being a whore. Soon, Marlene would tell everyone who cared to listen how much she hated her mother. But Marlene remained close to her father. At the age of 10, Marlene found adoption papers and confronted her father, asking what it meant. Jim explained what adoption is to the little girl, and she was understandably upset. When Marlene was 14, her father lost his job and the family moved back to the United States, settling in the Terra Linda community of the city of San Rafael, Marin County, California. Here in the United States, Jim Olive became a self-employed small business consultant and spent less time with his daughter as he tried to make his business succeed. So all of a sudden, Marlene Olives was always left alone with her alcoholic mother, and soon, they began butting heads again. Marlene, finding it difficult to adjust to her new environment, soon developed ulcer. She was prescribed medicines but soon started using the drugs recreationally. With her newfound freedom, Marlene also started hanging out with other drug users. She also became interested in glam rock, witchcraft, and prostitution. With time, the relationship between Marlene and Naomi Olive worsened and their arguments erupted into domestic violence. Over time, Marlene also developed resentment toward her father for siding with her mother in disputes. She also suspected him of informing police about her friend's drug activities. Overall, Marlene's behavior worsened. She shoplifted, stole her parents' credit cards, used and overdosed on drugs, and even ran away from home on multiple occasions. She also talked to several friends about wanting to kill her parents and asked some of them to help, but her friends either did not take her seriously or decided not to get involved. At one point, she even attempted to poison her mother herself by mixing large doses of prescription drugs into her mother's food, but the drugs made the food taste bitter, and Naomi refused to eat it. In school, Marlene became a loner. One particular day, Marlene took the drug known as LSD but had a horrible reaction to it. What's worse than dealing with hallucinations caused by a drug? Having to go through that in school. Teenagers laughed at Marlene making a fool of herself in school. In that moment she wished the ground would open up and swallow her. That was until her knight in shining armor came to her. He was 19-year-old drug dealer Charles Riley, known by everyone as Chuck. He was a high school dropout but frequented the school's lawns selling drugs. When he saw the teens teasing Marlene, he intervened and she was grateful. Charles had dropped out of high school because school became unbearable for him. He was overweight and kids always made snide remarks about him. This pushed him into theft and dealing of drugs. Although Chuck was a drug dealer, he was known by close friends and family to be a kind and soft-hearted person. He was way different from Marlene, and so it came as a shock to most people when they started hanging out. Almost immediately, Chuck became infatuated with Marlene, and at first, she acted like she didn't know about his growing feelings towards her, but then, she soon saw him as a person she could exert control over and could imprint with her dark fantasies. They started dating. She encouraged Chuck to take explicit photos of her, made him dress up in a leather mask and whip her, and one time, she even urinated on him in the presence of her friends. He continued to be infatuated with her and insisting he would be her slave. Under Marlene's tutelage, Chuck lost weight. This was seen as good for him by friends and family, but his behavior after weight loss got them worried. He had changed from the kind-hearted person he was and was now short-tempered, and always talked about the occult. Chuck provided his girlfriend with free drugs, gifts, and transportation. But, as she threatened to break up with him whenever he wasn't comfortable doing her bids. At Marlene's suggestion, the couple carried out a shoplifting spree, stealing approximately $6,000 worth of merchandise from local stores over several weeks. They were caught in March of 1975. Chuck at age 19 had no prior history of delinquency, and this was his first arrest ever. In May of 1975, Chuck was again arrested. At this, Marlene's parents threatened sending her to a juvenile detention center if she didn't stay away from Chuck. They also ordered Chuck to stay away from their daughter, and this increased Marlene's hatred for her parents. On Saturday, June 21, 1975, Marlene got into another argument with her mother. Marlene got so angry and called her boyfriend Chuck, telling him, "Get your gun, we've got to kill the bitch today." She arranged to go out with her father and told Chuck she would leave the door open for him, so he could enter and kill her mother. She then left the house with her father. When Chuck got to the house, Naomi was asleep. He then went ahead to strike Naomi many times with a hammer, stabbed and suffocated her. He spent so much time making sure Naomi Olive was dead that he didn't keep track of time. While he was still in the house, Jim Olive, Marlene's father, came home. He saw his wife laying lifeless on the floor and lost it. He picked up a steak knife and rushed towards Chuck. Seeing this, Chuck brought out a gun and shot Jim 4 times. Chuck and Marlene then tried to dispose of the Olives' bodies. They wrapped the bodies up in a rug, took it to the car, and transported the bodies to a wooded area at nearby China Camp. There, they burnt them in a barbecue pit with gasoline and logs in an effort to make them unrecognizable. They left while the bodies were still burning, and it was during this time that the firefighter was called. When they got home, they cleaned up the house along with a friend, before returning back to the barbecue pit to ensure remains were burnt. They then went ahead to take drugs, partied with friends, and even attended a concert. A few days later, Jim Olive's partner became concerned about his absence from work. He went to the home to check on Jim, but the house was empty. He then went to the police station to report the disappearance of his partner. Police went to the house and left a note requesting Jim to report to the station when he returned. When Marlene got home, she saw the note and made her way to the police station. She reported that her parents had gone on a trip and never returned. Suspicious of her story, police requested for an alibi which she provided. They later determined that her alibi was false, and so, they reached out to her again, and this time, she gave a different story. She claimed one parent had killed the other and then disappeared with the body. When police told her how absurd her claim was, she changed her story. This time, she claimed that both parents had been killed by members of the Hells Angels motorcycle club. Authorities didn't believe any of her stories. Police began getting anonymous calls claiming the Olives' remains were in a barbecue pit at China Camp. They searched the pit and found what was determined to be fragments of burnt human remains. Both Chuck and Marlene were arrested. After their arrest, Chuck confessed to killing Marlene's parents after planning the murders for a long time. He also said he did all that because Marlene made him do it. But Marlene had different claims. According to her, Chuck had killed her parents on his own and then held her hostage, forcing her to take drugs. Charles Chuck Riley was charged and convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death, which was later commuted to 2 concurrent life sentences with the possibility of parole after 7 years. Once eligible, he applied for parole at least 12 times but was denied each time. While in prison, he earned his GED, as well as associate and bachelor's degrees. He was finally granted parole in December of 2015. Marlene Olive, on the other hand, who was 16 years old at the time, was tried as a juvenile. The court ruled that she had encouraged, instigated, aided, abetted, and acted as an accomplice in the murder of her parents. She was sentenced to a term of 4 to 6 years confinement at the California Youth Authority at Ventura. A few weeks before she was due to be paroled, she escaped and fled to New York City, where she worked as a prostitute. She was later arrested and sent back to finish her sentence. She was released in 1980, at age 21. After her release, she moved to Los Angeles, where she changed her name multiple times. She went ahead to commit more crimes and was arrested multiple times and served time in jail at different points in her life. She was even called the Queen of the Trashers by Los Angeles Times in 1992. Her last known location was her being sentenced in 2003 to serve 7 years in prison for passing a fictitious check in Bakersfield. Marlene Olive and Chuck Riley were both young when the murders were committed. One person went on to serve 40 years in prison and turned his life around. The other served only 4 years, even when it was proven she was stable enough to be held accountable for her actions. She went on to become a menace to society at large. But one thing remains certain: 2 people who should have lived longer lost their lives. May their souls continue to rest in peace.